Some fines can't be measured in dollars, only in dignity. The afternoon sun hung low over the quiet stretch of Route 47, casting long shadows across the asphalt. It was the kind of road where nothing much happened, a two-lane ribbon cutting through farmland and forgotten towns, where the only sound was the hum of tires and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. But today, something different was unfolding. A silver sedan sat pulled over on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking in slow, rhythmic pulses. Behind it, a police cruiser sat at an angle, its red and blue lights spinning silently, painting the scene in alternating waves of color. Inside the sedan, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her name was Grace Turner. She was 62 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back into a neat bun, and a face that had seen both hardship and hope. She wore a simple floral blouse and a thin cardigan, the kind you find at a thrift store. Her hands were calloused from years of cleaning houses, and her eyes, deep brown and kind, held a quiet strength that came from surviving more than most people would ever know. She stared straight ahead, her breath steady, even as her heart hammered in her chest. Behind her, Officer Brent Calloway sat in his cruiser, writing something on a tablet. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut, and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from stone. He wore his uniform like armor, and his expression was hard, unreadable, cold. He had pulled her over 14 minutes ago. At first, Grace hadn't understood why. She'd been driving the speed limit, signaling at every turn, both hands on the wheel. She always drove carefully. She couldn't afford not to. But when the lights flashed behind her, her stomach had dropped. Not today, she had prayed silently. Please, not today. She had pulled over immediately, hands shaking as she turned off the engine. She had rolled down her window and waited, just as she'd been taught long ago, hands visible, no sudden movements, no excuses. Officer Calloway had approached slowly, his boots crunching on gravel. He'd looked at her license and registration without a word, his face hard as granite. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he'd asked. Grace had shaken her head gently. "No, sir, I don't believe I was speeding." "Your left taillight's out." She had blinked, confused. I didn't know. I'll get it fixed right away." "That's not how this works." And then he had walked back to his car. Now, as Grace sat waiting, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She thought of her grandson, Elijah, who was waiting for her at home. He was only 9 years old, and she was all he had. His mother, Grace's daughter, had passed 2 years ago, and his father had never been in the picture. Grace had taken him in without hesitation. She worked 3 cleaning jobs to keep them afloat. She made sure he had food, clothes, a roof over his head. She read to him every night before bed, even when she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She couldn't afford a fine, not even a small one. Her hands tightened in her lap. "Please, God," she whispered, "please let this be okay." Behind her, the cruiser door opened. Officer Calloway stepped out, his face unreadable, his posture rigid. He walked toward her car with slow, deliberate steps, a citation pad in his hand. Grace took a breath and turned to face him. He stopped at her window, looking down at her with cold, detached eyes. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "you're being cited for operating a vehicle with a faulty taillight. That's a safety violation." Grace nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I understand. I'll get it fixed today." "The fine is $8,000. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. $8,000. She stared at him, hopping, praying that she had misheard. But his expression didn't change. "8,000, she finally whispered. "That's correct." Her hands began to tremble. "Sir, I don't have that kind of money. I can barely." "That's not my concern," he said coldly. "You have 30 days to pay, or your license will be suspended and a warrant will be issued." Grace felt the world tilt. $8,000. For a tail light. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. Please, I'm raising my grandson. I work 3 jobs, I can't. Sign here. He held out the citation. Grace stared at it, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. And in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't about a tail light. This was about power. And she had none. She had survived worse storms than this, but none had cost $8,000. Grace Turner had learned a long time ago that life didn't ask permission before it broke you. She had learned it when her husband, Marcus, died suddenly of a heart attack at 43, leaving her alone with a mortgage and a 7-year-old daughter. She had learned it again when that daughter, Lydia, fell into addiction and never found her way back out. And she had learned it once more when Lydia died in a cold hospital room, leaving behind a frightened little boy who didn't understand why his mother wouldn't wake up. But Grace had survived all of it. She had worked 2 jobs, then 3. She had kept the lights on. She had kept food on the table. She had learned to live on 4 hours of sleep and prayers stitched together with hope. She had raised Elijah with every ounce of love she had left. And somehow it had been enough. Until now. The house Grace lived in was small, a 1-story rental on the edge of town, with peeling paint and a chain-link fence that leaned to one side. The yard was patchy, but Grace had planted flowers along the walkway, bright marigolds and purple petunias that she watered every morning before the sun came up. It wasn't much, but it was home. Inside, the furniture was old but clean. The couch had a faded floral pattern, covered with a handmade quilt. The walls were decorated with crayon drawings Elijah had made at school, stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a heart, was a note in Elijah's careful handwriting. "Grandma is the best, I love you." Grace had cried the first time she'd seen it. Every morning she woke at 5. She made breakfast, usually oatmeal or toast, and packed Elijah's lunch in a small blue lunchbox. She walked him to the bus stop at the end of the street, kissed his forehead, and watched until the bus disappeared around the corner. Then she went to work. Her first job was cleaning the offices at a law firm downtown. She scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans, vacuumed carpets. The lawyers never looked at her. She was invisible. Her second job was at a motel on the highway. She changed sheets, wiped down mirrors, and scrubbed bathtub rings left by strangers. The manager was rude, but the pay was steady. Her third job was cleaning houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. She dusted shelves lined with books no one read, polished silverware no one used, and cleaned floors that were already spotless. She did it all without complaint, because Elijah was counting on her. That morning before the traffic stop, Grace had been driving home from the motel job. She had been tired, bone tired, the kind that settles deep into your muscles and doesn't let go. Her back ached. Her knees throbbed. But she had been smiling, because tonight was special. Elijah had a school recital. He was going to sing in the choir, his first time performing in front of an audience. He had been practicing for weeks, singing the same song over and over in the living room, his small voice filled with pride and nerves. Grace had promised she would be there. She had even bought a small disposable camera so she could take pictures. She couldn't afford much, but she could afford that. As she drove down Route 47, she had been thinking about what she would say to him afterward. How proud she was, how much she loved him, how he reminded her so much of his mother when she was young before the world got hard. She had been thinking about that when the lights flashed behind her. Now, sitting in her car with the citation in her lap, Grace felt the weight of the world crushing down on her. $8,000. She didn't have $800. She didn't have 80. Her checking account had $73 in it. Her rent was due in 5 days. She still owed the electric company from last month. How was she supposed to pay this? Her hands trembled as she stared at the paper. She thought about calling someone, but who? She had no family left except Elijah. Her friends were just as broke as she was. She thought about the recital. She thought about Elijah's face, the way it would fall if she wasn't there. No, she told herself, I'll figure it out, I always do. But deep down, she didn't know how. Officer Calloway had already driven away by the time Grace finally started her car. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. She pulled back onto the road slowly, her vision blurred with unshed tears. The sun was lower now, casting everything in a golden, fatting light. She drove in silence, her mind racing. $8,000. 30 days. Or a warrant. She had never been in trouble with the law, not once. She had always followed the rules, always done what she was supposed to do. And now, because of a taillight she didn't even know was broken, her entire life was at risk. She thought about Elijah again. What would happen to him if she couldn't pay, if they suspended her license, if she couldn't get to work? What would happen if they took her away? Her chest tightened. No, she told herself again, that won't happen, I won't let it. But the fear was there, cold and heavy, settling into her bones. When she finally pulled into the driveway of her small house, the sun had almost set. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air smelled like cut grass and distant rain. Elijah was sitting on the front steps, waiting for her. He jumped up when he saw her car, his face lighting up with a smile that could have powered the whole street. "Grandma," he called, running toward her. Grace stepped out of the car, and despite everything, despite the fear, the exhaustion, the impossible fine, she smiled. Because that's what you did. You smiled for the people you loved, even when the world was falling apart. Sometimes the cruelest wounds are the ones delivered with a badge and a pen. Grace held Elijah tight as he wrapped his small arms around her waist. "You're late, Grandma," he said, looking up at her with wide, curious eyes. "I thought you forgot." "Never," Grace whispered, smoothing his hair. "I would never forget." But even as she said it, guilt twisted in her stomach. She had been late, because of the stop, because of Officer Calloway, because of a taillight she hadn't even known was broken. She pulled back and looked at Elijah's face, so innocent, so trusting. He was wearing his choir outfit, a white button-up shirt she had ironed that morning and black pants she had found at a yard sale. He looked so proud. "You look so handsome," she said softly. "Do you think I'll do good?" he asked, his voice small. "You'll do great," Grace said, kneeling down so she was eye level with him. "You've been practicing so hard. I'm already proud of you." His smile widened, and for a moment, Grace forgot about everything else. She forgot about the citation sitting in her purse. She forgot about the $8,000 she didn't have. She forgot about the 30-day deadline that was already counting down. For just a moment, it was only her and Elijah, and that was enough. The school auditorium was packed. Parents filled the rows of folding chairs, holding phones and cameras, whispering excitedly to one another. The stage was decorated with paper stars and streamers, and a banner across the back read, "Spring Recital, Let Your Light Shine." Grace sat near the back, clutching her disposable camera. She had used $3 from her grocery money to buy it, but she didn't regret it. This was important. Elijah was important. When the lights dimmed and the children filed onto the stage, Grace's heart swelled. She spotted Elijah in the second row, his hands clasped nervously in front of him, his eyes scanning the audience. When he saw her, his face broke into a smile. Grace waved and he waved back. Then the music started. The children sang a simple song about hope and dreaming big, their voices sweet and slightly off-key. Elijah sang every word with his whole heart, his small voice rising above the others. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She snapped picture after picture, even though she knew most of them would come out blurry. She didn't care. This was everything. After the recital, Grace took Elijah to a diner on the edge of town. It was a small place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. She ordered him a burger and fries, a treat they could barely afford, and a glass of milk. For herself, she ordered only water. "Aren't you hungry, Grandma?" Elijah asked, dipping a fry in ketchup. "I ate earlier," Grace lied, smiling. He didn't question it. They talked about the recital, about his friends, about a drawing he was working on in art class. Grace listened to every word, memorizing the sound of his laughter, the brightness in his eyes. She wanted to freeze this moment, because she didn't know how many more like it she would have. That night, after Elijah had gone to bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table with the citation spread out in front of her. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting shadows across the paper. $8,000. Due in 30 days. She had read it a dozen times, hoping the number would change, hoping it was a mistake. But it wasn't. She pulled out a calculator and a notebook. She wrote down her income from all 3 jobs. Then she wrote down her expenses: rent, electricity, water, food, gas, Elijah's school supplies. No matter how she rearranged the numbers, they didn't add up. She couldn't pay the fine. Not in 30 days, not in 60. Maybe not ever. Her hands shook as she set down the pen. She thought about calling the courthouse, asking if there was a payment plan, some way to reduce the fine. But she had heard stories. She knew how these things went. People like her, people with no money, no power, no lawyers, didn't get second chances. They got warrants. They got arrested. They got their children taken away. Grace pressed her hands to her face and let out a slow, shaking breath. She couldn't cry, not now, Elijah might hear. So she sat there in silence, staring at the numbers that didn't make sense, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Across town, Officer Brent Calloway sat in his living room, a beer in his hand, the television playing some crime drama he wasn't really watching. He thought about the woman he had pulled over that afternoon. Grace Turner. He had run her record, clean, not even a parking ticket. She had been polite, respectful, scared. He had seen the way her hands shook when he handed her the citation. But that wasn't his problem. Rules were rules. The fine was the fine. He took a sip of his beer and tried to push the thought away. But her face lingered in his mind, those kind, tired eyes. The way she had whispered, "Please, I'm raising my grandson." He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he was just doing his job. But something about it felt wrong. He just didn't know what. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn. She made breakfast for Elijah, walked him to the bus stop, and kissed his forehead. "Have a good day, baby," she said softly. "You too, Grandma." As the bus pulled away, Grace stood on the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared. Then she turned and walked back to the house. She had work in an hour, and a fine she couldn't pay, and a life that was slowly unraveling. But she kept walking, because that's what she did. She kept going, even when she didn't know how. Dignity costs nothing, but keeping it can cost everything. 3 days passed. 3 days of Grace scrubbing floors, washing dishes, folding linens, and pretending everything was fine. 3 days of Elijah asking her if she was okay and her smiling and saying, "Of course, baby. Grandma's just tired." 3 days of lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, running the same numbers over and over in her head. She had called the courthouse on the second day. The woman who answered had been polite but firm. "The citation amount is correct, ma'am. If you'd like to contest it, you can request a court date. Otherwise, payment is due in full within 30 days. Is there any way to set up a payment plan? Grace had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Not for traffic violations, ma'am. You can speak to a judge if you'd like, but that requires filing a formal appeal, and there's a processing fee. How much is the fee? $300. Grace had thanked her quietly and hung up. $300 just to ask for help. She didn't have it. On the fourth day, Grace went to the bank. It was a small branch on Main Street, with glass doors and a lobby that smelled like coffee and air conditioning. She stood in line, clutching her purse, her heart pounding. When it was her turn, she approached the teller, a young man with gelled hair and a name tag that read Kyle. "Good morning," he said with a rehearsed smile. "How can I help you today?" Grace swallowed. I need to apply for a loan." Kyle's smile didn't falter. "Of course. What kind of loan are you looking for?" "A personal loan, $8,000. He tapped something into his computer. "Okay, I'll need to pull your credit report and verify your income. Do you have recent pay stubs?" Grace reached into her purse and pulled out 3 crumpled pay stubs, one from each job. Kyle took them, his eyes scanning the numbers. His smile faded slightly. "And this is your total monthly income?" "Yes." He typed some more, his expression neutral now. Then he looked up. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Based on your income and credit history, we're unable to approve a loan at this time." Grace felt her chest tighten. "Please, I really need this. It's not for anything frivolous. It's a fine for my car. I can't lose my license. I need it for work." Kyle's face softened just a bit. "I understand, but our lending criteria are strict. Your debt-to-income ratio is too high. I'm sorry." Grace stood there for a moment, frozen. Then she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. And she walked out. That night Grace sat on the edge of Elijah's bed, watching him sleep. His small chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His hand was curled around the edge of his blanket, and his face was peaceful, unburdened. She reached out and gently brushed a curl away from his forehead. "What am I going to do?" she thought. She had tried everything she could think of. The bank had said no. The courthouse had offered no help. She had no one to borrow from. And the deadline was ticking closer every day. If she didn't pay, they would suspend her license. If they suspended her license, she couldn't drive to work. If she couldn't work, she couldn't pay rent. If she couldn't pay rent. She closed her eyes and took a slow, shaking breath. "God," she prayed silently, "I don't know what to do. Please, please show me the way." But the only answer was silence. On the 7th day, Grace made a decision. She would go back to Officer Calloway. She didn't know if it would help. She didn't even know if he would listen. But she had to try. She had looked up the address of the police station online. It was a small building on the outskirts of town, with a parking lot and a flagpole out front. Grace drove there after dropping Elijah off at school. Her hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. Her stomach was in knots. She parked in the lot and sat there for a full 5 minutes, trying to gather her courage. "You can do this," she told herself. "Just talk to him, explain. Maybe he'll understand." Finally, she got out of the car and walked inside. The lobby was sterile and cold, with fluorescent lights and a front desk behind a thick pane of glass. A woman in uniform sat behind it, typing on a computer. Grace approached slowly. "Excuse me," she said softly. The woman looked up. "Yes. I need to speak with Officer Brent Calloway." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Is this regarding an active case?" "Sort of. He gave me a citation. I just wanted to talk to him about it." The woman's expression didn't change. "Officer Calloway is on patrol. If you have a dispute with a citation, you need to handle that through the courthouse." "I tried," Grace said, her voice trembling. They said I need to pay $300 just to file an appeal. I don't have that. I just want to talk to him, to explain." The woman sighed. "Ma'am, I can't pull an officer off patrol for a conversation. If you'd like to leave a message." "Please," Grace interrupted, her voice breaking. "Please, I'm raising my grandson. I work 3 jobs. I can't afford this fine. I just need him to understand." The woman stared at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone. 20 minutes later, Officer Calloway walked into the lobby. He was in full uniform, his expression hard and unreadable. When he saw Grace sitting in one of the plastic chairs, something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or recognition. "Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice flat. Grace stood quickly. "Officer Calloway, thank you for seeing me." He didn't smile. "You have 5 minutes." Grace nodded, her heart pounding. I wanted to talk to you about the fine, $8,000. I can't pay it." "That's not my problem." "I know," Grace said quickly. "I know, but please, I'm not asking you to waive it. I'm just asking if there's any way to reduce it or set up a payment plan, anything." Calloway crossed his arms. "The fine is set by state law. I don't have the authority to change it." "Then who does?" "A judge, if you want to contest it." "I can't afford the filing fee," Grace said, her voice shaking. "I can barely afford to eat." Calloway's jaw tightened. "Then you should have made sure your vehicle was in working order." Grace flinched as if he had slapped her. For a moment she just stood there, staring at him. Then she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't know the light was out. I would have fixed it if I had. I'm not trying to break the law, I'm just trying to survive." Calloway said nothing. Grace took a breath. "I have a grandson. He's 9 years old. I'm all he has. If I lose my license, I lose my jobs. If I lose my jobs, I lose everything. Please, please don't do this to us." For a moment, just a moment, something softened in Calloway's eyes. But then it was gone. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't help you." And he turned and walked away. Grace stood there, alone in the cold fluorescent light, feeling the last bit of hope drain out of her. The truth has a way of finding you, even when you're running from it. Officer Brent Calloway couldn't stop thinking about her. It had been 2 days since Grace Turner had come to the station, and her face still haunted him. Those tired, pleading eyes. The way her voice had cracked when she said, "Please don't do this to us." He had walked away, he had done his job. But it didn't feel right. He told himself it wasn't personal. He told himself the law was the law. But late at night, when the house was quiet and he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something wrong. Brent Calloway had become a cop for all the right reasons. At least, that's what he told himself. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He had seen violence, poverty, addiction. He had watched good people get chewed up by a system that didn't care about them. And he had sworn he would be different. He would be one of the good guys. He would protect people, help them. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The job had hardened him. The endless paperwork, the hostile encounters, the constant feeling that no one respected him, it had worn him down. He had stopped seeing people. He had started seeing problems. And Grace Turner had been just another problem. A broken taillight, a citation, a case number. Nothing personal. But now, sitting in his patrol car on a quiet stretch of highway, he couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. "I'm just trying to survive." He thought about his own mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion just to keep him fed. He thought about how many times she had been one paycheck away from losing everything. He thought about how close they had come to being people like Grace Turner. And he felt sick. On the 10th day after the citation, Brent did something he had never done before. He looked up Grace Turner's file. It was a violation of protocol. Officers weren't supposed to dig into cases after they were closed, but he had to know. He pulled up her record on the computer in the precinct office. Clean, no priors, no history of anything. He clicked over to her address and ran a background check. What he found stopped him cold. Grace Turner, age 62, widowed, legal guardian of her grandson, Elijah Turner, age 9, mother deceased 2 years prior from drug-related complications. 3 jobs, combined income barely above the poverty line. No savings, no assets. And an $8,000 fine she would never be able to pay. Brent sat back in his chair, his chest tight. He had done this. He had ruined her life over a taillight. That afternoon, Brent drove past Grace's house. He didn't know why. Maybe he wanted to see if she was okay. Maybe he just needed to see her as a real person, not a name on a citation. The house was small, run-down, with peeling paint and a sagging fence. But the yard was neat, and flowers lined the walkway. As he slowed his cruiser, he saw her. She was standing in the driveway, loading groceries into the trunk of her car. Her movements were slow, tired. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn the day he pulled her over. And beside her was a little boy. Elijah. He was small, with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. He was helping her carry bags, his thin arms struggling under the weight. Grace said something to him, and he laughed. Brent's throat tightened. This was the woman he had fined $8,000. This was the child who would suffer because of it. He drove away before she could see him. That night, Brent couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the encounter over and over in his mind. He thought about the look on Grace's face when he had handed her the citation. He thought about the way she had begged him at the station. He thought about the little boy in the driveway, laughing and carrying groceries. And he thought about his mother. What would she say if she knew what he had done? Would she be proud of him? Or would she be ashamed? He already knew the answer. The next morning, Brent went to his sergeant's office. Sergeant Dale Hendricks was a gruff man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and a reputation for being by the book. "Calloway," Hendricks said, not looking up from his paperwork. "What do you need?" Brent hesitated. "I need to talk to you about a citation I issued last week." Hendricks glanced up. "What about it?" I think I made a mistake." Hendricks set down his pen. "What kind of mistake?" "The fine, $8,000 for a broken taillight. The woman, she can't pay it. She's raising her grandson. She works 3 jobs. I don't think the punishment fits the situation." Hendricks leaned back in his chair, studying Brent. "You feeling guilty, Calloway?" "Maybe," Brent admitted. "Well, don't. You did your job. The fine is set by the state, not by you. If she has a problem with it, she can take it up with a judge. She can't afford the filing fee." Hendricks shrugged. "Not your problem." Brent clenched his jaw. "Sir, with all due respect." "No," Hendricks interrupted. "You don't get to pick and choose which laws to enforce based on how you feel about someone. That's not how this works. You write the ticket. They pay the fine. End of story." Brent stared at him. "Is that all?" Hendricks asked. Brent nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." But as he walked out of the office, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this go. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. Grace had stopped praying. Not because she didn't believe anymore, but because she didn't know what to ask for. She had prayed for help. She had prayed for mercy. She had prayed for a miracle. And nothing had changed. The fine was still $8,000. The deadline was still coming. And she was still alone. On the 14th day, Grace received a letter in the mail. It was from the county courthouse, stamped in red ink, "Final notice." Her hands trembled as she opened it. This is your final notice regarding citation 47,829. Payment of $8,000 is due within 16 days. Failure to pay will result in suspension of your driver's license and the issuance of a warrant for your arrest. Grace read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She had no tears left. That afternoon, Grace did something she hadn't done in years. She went to the church. It was a small building on the edge of town, with white siding and a wooden cross above the door. She had gone there when Lydia was still alive, back when she still believed that prayer could fix things. She hadn't been back since the funeral. But today she needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt safe. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The sanctuary was empty. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the wooden pews. Grace walked down the aisle and sat in the front row. She folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. "God," she whispered, "I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if you care, but I need help. I don't know what else to do." Her voice cracked. "I'm so tired, I'm so scared, and I don't know how to keep going." She sat there in silence, waiting for something, a sign, a feeling, anything. But there was only quiet. Finally she stood up, wiped her eyes, and walked back outside. At that exact moment, Officer Brent Calloway was sitting in his patrol car, parked outside the police station. In his hand was a check for $8,000 from his own bank account. He had withdrawn it that morning, his hands shaking as he signed the slip. It was almost all the money he had saved, money he had been setting aside for a down payment on a house, money that represented years of careful planning. But he couldn't keep it. Not when he knew what he had done. He stared at the check, his jaw tight. This wasn't about the money. This was about doing the right thing, even if it cost him everything. Brent drove to the courthouse and walked inside, the check folded in his pocket. He approached the clerk's desk, where a middle-aged woman with glasses was typing on a computer. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need to pay a citation," Brent said. She looked up. "Do you have the citation number?" He recited it from memory. She typed it in, then frowned. "This citation was issued to a Grace Turner. Are you paying on her behalf?" "Yes." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Are you a family member?" "No." "Then I'll need written authorization from Ms. Turner, stating that you have permission to." "I'm the officer who issued the citation," Brent interrupted. The clerk blinked. "I'm sorry. I wrote the ticket, and I'm paying it." She stared at him, confused. "Sir, that's highly irregular." "I don't care," Brent said. "Can you process the payment or not?" The clerk hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, I can process it." Brent handed her the check. She took it, still looking bewildered, and began typing. A few minutes later, she handed him a receipt. "The citation has been cleared. Ms. Turner's record will be updated within 24 hours." Brent took the receipt and nodded. Then he turned and walked out. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove to Grace's house. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't even know if she would open the door. But he had to see her. He parked on the street and walked up the cracked driveway, his heart pounding. He knocked on the door. A few seconds later, it opened. Grace stood there, her eyes widening in surprise. "Officer Calloway." "Mrs. Turner," Brent said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Grace's face tightened. "If this is about the fine I still don't have." "It's paid," Brent said. Grace froze. "What?" "The fine, it's been paid in full. Your record is clear." Grace stared at him, her mouth open. I don't understand." Brent took a breath. "I paid it." You paid it?" "Yes." "Why?" Brent looked down at his hands. Because I was wrong. I shouldn't have given you that citation. It wasn't fair, and I couldn't let you suffer because of my mistake. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Brent said. I just wanted you to know you're free. You don't owe anything. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Brent nodded, his throat tight. Then he turned to leave. But Grace's voice stopped him. Officer Calloway. He turned back. Why did you really do this? She asked softly. Brent was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because you reminded me of my mother, and I realized I don't want to be the kind of man who makes life harder for people like her. Or you. Grace smiled through her tears. Your mother raised a good man. Brent didn't know what to say. So he just nodded and walked away. Guilt is a mirror, and sometimes what it shows you changes everything. Brent Calloway drove home in silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind replaying the look on Grace Turner's face when he told her the fine was paid. The disbelief, the tears, the gratitude. It should have felt good. It should have felt like redemption. But instead, all he felt was hollow. Because paying the fine didn't undo what he had done. It didn't erase the 2 weeks Grace had spent in fear, wondering how she would survive. It didn't erase the nights she had probably stayed awake, sick with worry. It didn't erase the fact that he had used his power to hurt someone who had done nothing wrong. He pulled into his driveway and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. That night, Brent called his mother. She lived 3 states away in a small apartment near the coast. He didn't call her often, maybe once a month if that. Life got busy. He always meant to call more. But tonight, he needed to hear her voice. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Brent, her voice was warm, surprised. Honey, is everything okay? Yeah, Mom, I wanted to talk. Of course, what's going on? Brent hesitated. Do you remember when I told you I wanted to be a cop? His mother was quiet for a moment. I do. You were 17. You said you wanted to help people. Yeah, Brent said softly. I did. And you have, sweetheart. You've done so much good. Brent closed his eyes. I'm not so sure about that. What do you mean? He told her everything. About the traffic stop, about Grace Turner, about the $8,000 fine, about how he had walked away when she begged for help, about how he had finally paid it himself 2 weeks too late. When he finished, his mother was silent. Then she said, Brent, do you remember when you were 10 and you broke Mrs. Palmer's window playing baseball? Brent frowned. Yeah, why? Do you remember what I told you? He thought for a moment. You said I had to apologize and pay for it. And did you? Yes. And how did you feel afterward? Brent paused. Better, like I had made it right. That's because you took responsibility, his mother said gently. You didn't make excuses. You didn't blame someone else. You owned what you did and you fixed it. That's what good people do. Brent's throat tightened. But I shouldn't have done it in the first place. No, his mother agreed. You shouldn't have, but you're human, Brent. You made a mistake. And then you did something most people never do. You admitted it. You made it right. That takes courage. I don't feel courageous, Brent said quietly. I feel like a failure. His mother's voice softened. Honey, being a good person doesn't mean you never mess up. It means you try to do better when you do, and you did that. You saw the hurt you caused and you fixed it. That's not failure. That's growth. Brent didn't respond. Are you okay? His mother asked. I don't know, Brent admitted. I keep thinking about her face. The way she looked at me when I handed her that citation. She was so scared, and I didn't care. But you care now, his mother said, and that matters. Brent nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thanks, Mom. I love you, sweetheart. I love you too. He hung up and sat in the dark, his mother's words echoing in his mind. You saw the hurt you caused, and you fixed it. But had he really fixed it? Or had he just put a bandage on a wound that would never fully heal? The next day, Brent went back to the station. He sat at his desk, staring at the stack of paperwork in front of him, but he couldn't focus. All he could think about was Grace. And Elijah. And the system that had almost destroyed them. Around noon, Sergeant Hendricks walked by and stopped at Brent's desk. "Calloway," he said, "you look like hell." Brent glanced up. "I'm fine." Hendricks crossed his arms. "I heard you paid off a citation, out of your own pocket." Brent tensed. "Who told you that?" "Clerk at the courthouse. Word gets around." Hendricks studied him. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Brent hesitated. Then he said, "I made a mistake. I gave someone a fine they couldn't pay, so I paid it." Hendricks raised an eyebrow. "That's not your job." "I know. You can't save everyone, Calloway." "I wasn't trying to save everyone," Brent said. "I was just trying to do the right thing." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're a good cop, Calloway, but you're going to burn yourself out if you take every case personally." "Maybe," Brent said, "but I'd rather burn out doing the right thing than live comfortably doing the wrong one." Hendricks stared at him. Then for the first time he smiled. "Your mother raised you right." Brent blinked. "How did you?" "Because I can tell," Hendricks said. "You've got a conscience. Not enough cops do anymore." He clapped Brent on the shoulder. "Keep it. The world needs more people like you." And then he walked away. That evening, Brent drove past Grace's house again. He didn't stop. He just slowed down, watching from a distance. The lights were on inside. Through the window, he could see Grace and Elijah sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner. They were laughing about something. Grace's face was brighter than he had ever seen it. And in that moment, Brent understood something. Paying the fine hadn't been about erasing his guilt. It had been about giving Grace her life back. And that was enough. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing grace over bitterness. 2 weeks after Brent paid the fine, Grace Turner did something she hadn't done in a long time. She baked a pie. It was a simple apple pie, with a lattice crust and a dusting of cinnamon sugar. She had found the recipe in an old cookbook that had belonged to her mother, and she had spent the afternoon carefully peeling apples and rolling out dough. Elijah had helped, his small hands clumsily crimping the edges of the crust. "Why are we making a pie, Grandma?" he had asked. "Because we need to say thank you to someone," Grace had said. "Who?" "You'll see." Now, as the pie cooled on the kitchen counter, Grace wrapped it carefully in aluminum foil and placed it in a wicker basket. She looked at herself in the hallway mirror, smoothing down her hair. She was wearing her Sunday dress, the nicest thing she owned, and a light cardigan. She wanted to look presentable. "Come on, baby," she called to Elijah. "We need to make a delivery." Elijah bounded out of his room, curious and excited. "Where are we going?" "To see the police officer," Grace said gently. Elijah's eyes widened. "The one who gave you the ticket?" "Yes, but he did something very kind for us, and we need to thank him properly." Grace had called the police station earlier that day and asked when Officer Calloway would be on duty. The dispatcher had told her he would be at the station until 5 o'clock. It was 4:30 now. Grace drove slowly, her heart beating steadily in her chest. Elijah sat beside her, holding the basket on his lap. "Grandma," he said quietly. "Yes, baby." "Are you scared?" Grace glanced at him. "Why would I be scared?" Because police are scary sometimes." Grace's chest tightened. She pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face him. "Elijah," she said softly, "not all police officers are scary. Some of them make mistakes just like we do. But the good ones, the really good ones, they try to make things right. And Officer Calloway is one of the good ones. Elijah nodded slowly. Okay. Grace kissed his forehead. You're so smart, you know that. He smiled. When they arrived at the station, Grace parked in the lot and took a deep breath. Ready? She asked Elijah. He nodded. They walked inside together, Grace carrying the basket. The same woman from before was at the front desk. She looked up when they entered, recognition flickering across her face. Mrs. Turner, she said, surprised. Hello, Grace said politely. Is Officer Calloway available? The woman hesitated. He's finishing up some paperwork. Can I ask what this is about? I just wanted to thank him, Grace said simply. The woman's expression softened. Let me see if he's free. She picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. A moment later, she hung up and nodded. He'll be right out. A few minutes later, Brent Calloway walked into the lobby. He was in uniform, but his tie was loosened and his sleeves were rolled up. He looked tired. When he saw Grace and Elijah, he stopped. Mrs. Turner, he said, his voice uncertain. Grace smiled. Hello, Officer Calloway. I hope we're not interrupting. No, Brent said quickly. Not at all. He glanced down at Elijah, then back at Grace. Is everything okay? Everything is wonderful, Grace said. Thanks to you. She held out the basket. We made you something to say thank you. Brent stared at the basket, then at her. You didn't have to do that. I know, Grace said, but I wanted to. Slowly, Brent took the basket. He lifted the foil and saw the pie, golden and perfect. His throat tightened. This is really kind of you, he said, his voice rough. It's the least I could do, Grace said. You gave me my life back. You gave me hope when I had none. I don't know how to repay that. Brent shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I was just trying to fix what I broke. Grace stepped closer. You did more than that. You showed me that there are still good people in this world, people who care, people who do the right thing even when it costs them something. Brent looked down, his jaw tight. Officer Calloway, Grace said gently, I forgive you. Brent's head snapped up. What? I forgive you, Grace repeated. For the fine, for the way you treated me, for everything. I know you were just doing your job, and I know you've been carrying guilt because of it, but I don't want you to carry it anymore. You made it right, and I'm grateful. Brent's eyes shone with unshed tears. He didn't know what to say. Elijah tugged on Grace's sleeve. Grandma. She looked down at him. Yes, baby. Can I give him my picture? Grace smiled. Of course. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He walked up to Brent and held it out shyly. I made this for you, he said quietly. Brent knelt down and took the paper. He unfolded it carefully. It was a crayon drawing. On one side was a stick figure with a police badge. On the other side was a stick figure holding the hand of a smaller stick figure. Above them, in shaky letters, Elijah had written, Thank you for helping my grandma. Brent stared at the drawing, his vision blurring. His voice broke. This is the nicest thing anyone's ever given me. Elijah beamed. You can keep it. I will, Brent said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll keep it forever. Grace placed a hand on Brent's shoulder. You're a good man, Officer Calloway, she said. Don't ever forget that. Brent looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, he whispered. Grace smiled. No, thank you. As Grace and Elijah turned to leave, Brent called out. Mrs. Turner. She turned back. If you ever need anything, Brent said, anything at all, you call me, okay? Grace nodded, okay. And then they walked out into the late afternoon light. Brent stood there in the lobby, holding the basket in one hand and the drawing in the other. The woman at the desk looked at him. You okay, Calloway? Brent wiped his eyes and nodded. Yeah, he said, I'm okay. For the first time in weeks, he meant it. In a world that teaches us to demand justice, sometimes the greatest power is choosing mercy. Life didn't suddenly become easy for Grace Turner. The bills still came. The jobs were still hard. The exhaustion still settled into her bones at the end of every long day. But something had changed. The weight she had been carrying, the fear, the hopelessness, the crushing certainty that the world was against her, had lifted. She had been given a second chance. And she wasn't going to waste it. 3 months after the fine was paid, Grace received a letter in the mail. It was from Officer Brent Calloway. Inside was a handwritten note on plain white paper. Dear Mrs. Turner, I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me that day at the station, about forgiveness, about doing the right thing. I want you to know that you changed my life. Before I met you, I had forgotten why I became a police officer. I had forgotten that my job isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about protecting people, helping them, seeing them as human beings, not just problems to solve. You reminded me of that. You also reminded me of something my mother used to say. The measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who can't. You treated me with kindness and forgiveness, even though I didn't deserve it, even though I had hurt you. That kind of grace is rare, and it's something I'll never forget. I hope you and Elijah are doing well. I think about you both often. Thank you for giving me a second chance. With gratitude and respect. Brent Calloway. Grace read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, next to the recipe for apple pie. On a warm Saturday morning in late spring, Grace and Elijah were planting flowers in the front yard. The marigolds were in full bloom now, and the petunias had spread across the walkway in waves of purple and pink. Grace had added some sunflowers along the fence, tall and bright, reaching toward the sun. Elijah was digging a hole for a new plant, his tongue sticking out in concentration. "Grandma," he said. "Yes, baby." "Do you think Officer Calloway is happy?" Grace smiled. "I think so. Why do you ask?" "Because he was sad when we gave him the pie, but then he smiled, and I think smiling means you're happy." Grace set down her trowel and looked at Elijah. "You're right, smiling does mean you're happy, but sometimes people smile because they're grateful, or relieved, or because someone showed them kindness when they needed it most." Elijah thought about that, like when you hug me after I have a bad dream. "Exactly like that," Grace said, pulling him close. They worked in silence for a while, the sun warm on their backs, the smell of earth and flowers filling the air. That afternoon, as Grace was washing dishes, she heard a car pull up outside. She dried her hands and looked out the window. A police cruiser was parked in front of the house. For a moment, her heart clenched with old fear. But then she saw Brent Calloway step out, and the fear melted away. He was in uniform, but he was smiling. Grace opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. "Officer Calloway." "Mrs. Turner," Brent said, walking up the driveway, "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," Grace said. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Brent said. I wanted to stop by and see how you were doing." Grace smiled. "We're doing well, really well." Brent nodded, looking relieved. "I'm glad." Elijah appeared in the doorway, his eyes lighting up. "Officer Calloway." "Hey, buddy," Brent said, kneeling down. "How are you?" "Good, we planted sunflowers." "That's awesome," Brent said. "Can I see?" Elijah grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the yard, chattering excitedly about the flowers. Grace watched them, her heart full. An hour later, after Brent had admired the garden and shared a glass of lemonade on the porch, he stood to leave. "Thank you for stopping by," Grace said. "It means a lot." "Thank you," Brent said, "for everything." As he turned to go, Grace called out, "Officer Calloway." He looked back. "You're always welcome here," she said. "Anytime." Brent smiled, a real genuine smile. "I'd like that." As Brent drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Grace and Elijah waving from the porch. He waved back, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. 6 months later, Grace stood in the back of the church, watching Elijah rehearse for the Christmas pageant. He was playing a shepherd, wearing a pillowcase draped over his head and carrying a wooden staff. He looked ridiculous and adorable, and Grace couldn't stop smiling. A voice spoke beside her. "He's gotten so big." Grace turned. Brent Calloway stood there, dressed in casual clothes, holding a wrapped gift. Grace's eyes widened. "Brent, what are you doing here?" "Elijah invited me," Brent said, a little sheepishly. "He called the station and left a message, said I should come watch him in the pageant." Grace laughed. "That sounds like him." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the children rehearse. "Grace," Brent said quietly. "Yes." "Thank you for not giving up on me." Grace looked at him. "Thank you for not giving up on yourself." The lesson. That Christmas, as snow fell softly outside the church windows and carols filled the air, Grace sat in the front row with Brent beside her. Elijah stood on stage, singing with all his heart, his face glowing with joy. And Grace thought about everything that had happened. The traffic stop, the fine, the fear, the kindness, the forgiveness. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything. And how a single act of courage, from a man who had every reason to walk away, had changed everything. Later that night, Grace wrote in her journal, "I used to think that justice meant getting what you deserve, but I've learned something different. Justice is important, but mercy is stronger. Kindness is stronger than anger. Forgiveness heals more than punishment. And sometimes, the people who hurt us are the ones who need grace the most." Officer Calloway didn't have to help me. He could have walked away, but he didn't. He chose to do the right thing, even when it cost him something. And in doing so, he taught me that goodness still exists in this world. That people can change. That second chances matter. I will never forget what he did for us. And I will spend the rest of my life passing that kindness forward. The final scene. Years later, on a warm summer evening, Grace sat on her porch in a rocking chair. She was older now, her hair completely silver, her hands more gnarled, but her eyes were still kind. Elijah, now a young man, sat beside her, holding the hand of a young woman he would soon marry. "Grandma," he said, "tell us the story again, about the police officer." Grace smiled. "You've heard that story 100 times. "I know," Elijah said, "but it's my favorite." So Grace told the story. About the traffic stop, about the impossible fine, about the officer who paid it. About forgiveness and redemption. About how one act of kindness can change everything. And when she finished, Elijah's fiancée wiped tears from her eyes. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "It is," Grace agreed, "because it's true." She looked out at the street, at the flowers blooming in her yard, at the life she had built despite everything. And she thought about Brent Calloway, who she still saw from time to time at church, at community events, at Elijah's graduation. He had become more than the officer who gave her a ticket. He had become a friend. A reminder that people are capable of great harm, but also great good. And that the choice between the two is ours to make. Grace's final words, spoken softly into the evening air. "In this life we will all make mistakes. We will all hurt people, whether we mean to or not. But the question isn't whether we fail. The question is, what do we do after? Do we harden our hearts and walk away? Or do we find the courage to make it right?" Officer Calloway chose courage. And in doing so, he didn't just save my life. He saved his own soul. That's the power of mercy. That's the power of forgiveness. That's the power of love.